The committee meets in executive session to consider the nominations of 4 qualified presidential nominees: Dr. Jared Bernstein to be chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Solomon Green to be Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD, David Uegio to be Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing Equal Opportunity at HUD, Dr. Ron Brzezowski to be Director of the Office of Financial Research, Department of Treasury. I'll keep my remarks brief. Banking and housing has a tradition of members voting for the president's pick to be chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, regardless of political party. When I was the ranking member in 2017, I voted for Kevin Hassett, not because I loved him or he would not have been my pick. I did it because that's the tradition. He was president's nominee to serve as CEA chair. 2021, ranking member Toomey voted for Cecilia Rouse, President Biden's CEA nominee. The Senate confirmed both of them with strong bipartisan support. Dr. Hassett's nomination, 81-16, in part because this committee was bipartisan in that selection. Dr. Rouse's nomination was even more overwhelmingly confirmed. Prior chairs, ranking members similarly voted for the other party's CEA chair. The president should have his pick for CEA chair. We should not continue. We should continue that bipartisan tradition. I'm pleased to support the nomination of Jared Bernstein to be chair. He's an exceptionally qualified economist, decades of experience. Last month, others wanting to continue the tradition, seven former Republican CEA chairs wrote to the committee in support of his nomination. They believe in this tradition too. 3 of those served under President Trump. If his peers, who often disagree with them, support Dr. Bernstein, there is simply no good reason why this committee shouldn't, in bipartisan fashion, vote to advance his nomination. There are reasons, but there are no good reasons. Second, the committee will vote on the nominations of Solomon Green and David Uegio to serve in important positions at HUD. Both are well qualified since 2022. Mr. Green has served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD. He previously served as a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, a senior advisor at HUD in private law practice. Since 2012, he served in various roles at CFPB. President's nominated Ron Brzezowski to serve as Director of the Office of Financial Research at the Department of Treasury from 2011 to 2019 under both Democrat and Republican directors. Dr. Brzezowski served in various roles in the Office of Research at the CFPB. His experience has prepared him to lead OFR as it aims to deliver high-quality financial data and analysis. I urge my colleagues to support all 4 nominations. Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, this committee is considering 4 nominees for positions across our federal government. As I said during the nominations hearing on April 18th, nominees should inspire confidence, have strong respect for the rule of law, and support policies that promote the American dream. Sadly, 3 of today's nominees fall short of those criteria: Jared Bernstein, Solomon Green, and David Uegio. Each have demonstrated time and again, from public comments to even their answers to this committee's questions, that they are not looking after the interests of everyday Americans, but are wedded to helping this administration achieve its progressive policy goals. I have seen comments from colleagues here in the Senate that sound the alarm for Mr. Bernstein. And to be frank, his comments during our hearing only further demonstrated that Mr. Bernstein would be the most extreme nominee we have ever had for the position of chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, a role traditionally held by non-political economists. While I appreciate Mr. Bernstein's support of opportunity zones, unfortunately, his largely partisan record of advocating for extreme progressive policy positions, including universal government guaranteed jobs, universal government-run healthcare systems, higher taxes, including a carbon tax and wealth tax, and the Green New Deal, deeply concern me. Even in his written responses to questions from this committee, Mr. Bernstein admits that he stands behind many of his most troubling past statements, including his support for taxing Americans' unrealized gains. As families struggle to fill their gas tanks and drive their kids to school or go to work, Mr. Bernstein admits that he still supports the administration's decision to shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, a decision to shut down America's own energy production. As while everyday Americans suffer at the pump, Mr. Bernstein has written that prices of fossil fuels should be higher than they are. And he also criticized the low gas prices in 2019 as well, arguing that they are not where they need to be to negate the negative environmental effects of oil and gas. I would imagine that the vast majority of Americans find themselves appalled, stunned, and frankly, under the weight of inflation and higher gas prices. While we look forward to ways and opportunities to work in bipartisan fashion, we don't see it on the nominees today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Scott. I'm sorry that another long-held bipartisan tradition of the United States Senate has been consigned to the dustbin of history. We need to wait a couple minutes until the other members arrive, so we will just suspend. Thank you. We will now proceed to vote. We will now proceed to vote on the nomination of today's four nominees. I'll move to a roll call vote on Jared Bernstein's nomination to be Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Tester. Aye. Mr. Warner. Aye. Ms. Warren.
Aye.
Mr. Van Hollen.
Aye.
Ms. Cortez Masto.
Aye.
Ms. Smith.
Aye.
Ms. Sinema.
Aye.
Mr. Warnock.
Aye.
Mr. Fetterman.
Aye.
Mr. Scott.
No.
Mr. Crapo.
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty.
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis.
No by proxy.
Mr. Vance.
No.
Mrs. Britt.
No.
Mr. Kramer.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines. Mr. Chairman, the vote is 12 to 11. The nominee is approved.
The ayes have it. With that, the nominations ordered hereby reported favorably to the full Senate. I now move to a roll call vote on the nomination of Mr. Solomon Green being Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Tester. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren.
Aye.
Mr. Van Hollen. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Smith. Ms. Sinema.
Aye.
Mr. Warnock.
Aye.
Mr. Fetterman. Mr. Scott.
No.
Mr. Crapo.
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds.
No.
Mr. Tillis. Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty.
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis.
No by proxy.
Mr. Vance.
No.
Mrs. Britt.
No.
Mr. Kramer.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines.
No.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 12 to 11 in favor. The nominee is approved.
Reported favorably to the full Senate. I now move to a roll call vote on the nomination of David Weggio to be an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Tester. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren.
Aye.
Mr. Van Hollen. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Smith.
Aye.
Ms. Sinema.
Aye.
Mr. Warnock.
Aye.
Mr. Fetterman. Mr. Scott.
No.
Mr. Crapo.
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty.
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis.
No by proxy.
Mr. Vance.
Aye.
Ms. Britt.
No.
Mr. Kramer.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines. Mr. Chairman, the vote is 13 in favor and 10 opposed. The nominee is approved.
That the nominations hereby ordered reported favorably to the full Senate. I now move to roll call vote on the nomination of Ron Brzezikowski to be Director of Financial Research, Department of Treasury for a term of 6 years. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Reed.
Aye.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Tester. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren.
Aye.
Mr. Van Hollen. Ms. Cortez Masto.
Aye.
Ms. Smith.
Aye.
Ms. Sinema.
Aye.
Mr. Warnock.
Aye.
Mr. Fetterman. Mr. Scott.
No.
Mr. Crapo.
No by proxy.
Mr. Rounds.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Haggerty.
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis.
No by proxy.
Mr. Vance.
No.
Mrs. Britt. Mr. Kramer.
No by proxy.
Mr. Daines.
No.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 12 in favor, 11 opposed. The nominee is approved.
Favorably to the full Senate. Thank you, everyone. The clerk will see to reporting these nominations to the full Senate. Thank you to my colleagues for being here. The hearing will follow, and hope many of you come back. Any senators wish to make a statement about any of this? All right, will the first panel please come forward? I guess Senator Merkley is here. Thank you. Senator Scott and I will make our opening statements, and then we will turn to the first panel and then the second panel. Thanks to Senators Merkley and Daines for being here to testify. Welcome to our other witnesses on the second panel. Thank you to Ranking Member Scott for working with us on this hearing. The cannabis landscape looks far different than it did a few short years ago. Cannabis has been legalized or decriminalized in almost every state. States and localities have established licensing and social equity programs to ensure that small businesses and communities impacted by the war on drugs are part of the growing legal cannabis industry. Today, we'll hear about the challenges that small businesses and workers continue to face and how we can empower and protect workers, provide stronger consumer and small business protections, and ensure fair and equitable access to financial services, all while making sure that our communities stay safe. Banking, of course, is critical for small cannabis businesses who already face hurdles getting their businesses off the ground. Like any business, they need to apply for licenses and raise capital. That's hard to do when you don't have a bank account, or if you do, one that might come with a lot of fees. Without full access to the banking and payment system, legal cannabis businesses are forced to operate in the shadows. They can't access SBA loans and know that even if they try to apply for a bank loan, they may go through all the costs and efforts only to be denied. So many small businesses rely on friends and family for funding. They deal with lots of cash, spend precious time trying to find a workaround, or hire expensive third-party service providers that take a hefty cut off of their slim profits. It puts a robbery target on the backs of workers and can make it harder to combat money laundering. There are thousands of workers who can't prove their income to get a mortgage or a car loan or keep a personal bank account, even though their paychecks came from a business that is perfectly legal in their state. Many of these workers are represented by unions, important to this committee, represented by unions like the UFCW and the International Brother of Teamsters, which are fighting to make sure that their workers have more power in the workplace in an industry where their physical safety is too often at risk. The effects of this patchwork system go beyond just the cannabis industry. Sheet metal and air conditioning contractors build service retail locations and other facilities. Lawn care and gardening companies like Scott's Miracle Grow in Central Ohio sell materials and equipment. They want to continue their businesses. They want to serve their customers. They don't want to worry that it'll put their bank accounts at risk. While small businesses and workers deal with these challenges, the large cannabis companies are the ones dominating the market. They have ready access to private capital. They're taking advantage of their workers with unfair labor practices to maximize profits. I stand by the workers who are actively fighting for higher wages and safer workplaces. We don't want the cannabis industry to become like big tobacco, concentrating industry power in just a few giant places. We know what that leads to. It hurts workers. It pushes out thousands of small businesses. Those small businesses likely to be owned by black and brown entrepreneurs and women and veterans. We want small banks and credit unions and MDIs and CDFIs to be able to serve small businesses and their workers and level the playing field in an industry increasingly concentrated. Community banks and credit unions in my state want to serve the legal cannabis industries in their communities. I've met many of them. They want to rest assured that they can continue to bank their existing customers. Banks and credit unions shouldn't have to pick and choose which services they can offer to customers that happen to earn their income from a cannabis business. People in the cannabis industry should be able to have the same types of personal and commercial and mortgage loans that other customers have, with the same protections without additional costs or fees. As we know, the over-criminalization of marijuana has disproportionately hurt communities of color and indigenous communities. We have a long way to go to right these wrongs. We start by ensuring that members of these communities not only benefit from, but also lead the growth of the legal cannabis industry. MDIs and CDFIs can help reach these communities that are often overlooked or, worse, preyed upon by other financial institutions. People with prior marijuana convictions, especially in states where it is now legal, shouldn't be barred from participating in our economy, whether it's renting a home or finding a good paying job. We want safe communities and a safe banking system. We all know after the 3 recent bank failures sparked by a panic-induced run, banks must manage better the risks of their businesses. They need to understand that failure to meet stakeholder expectations can have dire consequences for their customers. We must not weaken regulators' ability to protect consumers in the banking system from these risks. Financial institutions play an important role in monitoring our financial system for fraud, money laundering, and other illegal activities. We need to ensure that workers in small businesses and cannabis industry can access banking while maintaining our robust anti-money laundering framework. I've heard from law enforcement officials who say that expanding banking access to cannabis businesses can help improve public safety and direct resources towards truly criminal activity. Cannabis banking is, of course, just one part of the conversation on marijuana policy. People shouldn't be thrown in jail for a product that others are legally profiting from. We've been able to work together in the past on a bipartisan basis to give those with prior convictions a second chance. Everyone, including our veterans, should have access to the medicine they need to care for themselves and their family. If we truly care about public health, we should consider more medical and scientific research on this topic. Something that Senator Tester has been particularly involved in as the leader of the Veterans Committee. There's more work to be done to make sure everyone can participate in the banking system, the legal economy, cannabis economy in a fair, safe, and equitable way. I'm glad we're building on the progress we've made over the years. I look forward to continuing these conversations. Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of you for being here with us today, particularly Senator Daines for your hard work, dedication on this topic for a number of years, as well as acknowledging both Senator Kramer and Lummis for their hard work as well on such an important topic. Each one of us on this committee represents different states with different marijuana laws, and I understand that some of us may be in very different places when it comes to the legality of marijuana. In my home state of South Carolina, marijuana is largely still illegal, and I myself have concerns with it. And at the federal level, marijuana is considered a Schedule I drug, which means that the possession, distribution, or sale of marijuana and other marijuana-derived products is illegal, and that proceeds from marijuana-related businesses are subject to U.S. anti-money laundering laws. The Department of Justice and national law enforcement groups have expressed concerns that SAFE Banking Act would create loopholes in our money laundering laws, making it harder to catch criminals that traffic weapons, fentanyl, and even people much harder, which is a consequence that we must eliminate if this bill is to become law. However, there are some states that have legalized marijuana, and now we have legal state-based marijuana-related businesses throughout the country that depend on a relationship with their bank or credit union. And as a former small business owner, I understand and appreciate the importance of having that relationship with your financial institution. A banking relationship is crucial to providing safety and stability for a company, its employees, and the customers it serves. That is why I'm looking forward to hearing from our second panel of witnesses on how these businesses operate, the complications faced by these businesses, and how the safe harbor provided in the SAFE Banking Act would work in practice or, if more is needed, to ensure compliance. Finally, if we are going to have a conversation about safe banking and banking a product that is illegal at the federal level, then we must discuss the importance of banking all industries. In the past few years, we have seen certain financial institutions cave to political pressures and take actions to debank certain legal industries, such as firearms and oil and gas entities, due to the wild progressive nature of the radical left in their agenda. The same institutions that are asking us to take a second look at the Safe Banking Act are frankly standing in the way of banking legal entities today. I find that disappointing and quite perplexing. Congress has a responsibility to ensure that all legal industries have access to financial institutions and services. I understand that safe banking, as drafted, currently contains a provision to ensure that legal industries are banked. Debanking legal industries is inappropriate, and I look forward to hearing more about that part of the legislation as we continue the discussion today. I hope today's hearings lends itself to a thoughtful debate on the issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Scott. First panel, I invite Senator Merkley of Oregon. Thank you for your work on this. Senator Daines of Montana to speak. Some, as you both know, as this has moved perhaps more slowly than many hoped, have tried to use this issue as a backdoor way to weaken bank safeguards that protect our economy. I want to be clear, nothing goes through this committee that weakens consumer protections and the safety and soundness of the banking industry. Senator Merkley, please begin.
Well, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing today on the Safe Banking Act. I got engaged in this issue some 8 years ago because of the problems created by the cash economy in cannabis. And from the beginning, it's been a bipartisan effort to undertake address these challenges. And a compliment to Senator Cory Gardner, former Senator Cory Gardner, who worked on this. And it's been a real pleasure to work with my colleague, Steve Daines of Montana, as we seek to pursue solutions to really the advancement of crime through a cash economy. And Chairman Brown, thank you for your partnership and for the collaboration that brought us to this moment today. Half of the states across our nation have some form of legalized cannabis. 37 states have legal cannabis for medicinal purposes, and 21 have legal cannabis for recreational use. It's now an industry that supports 428,000 jobs. It accounts for $25 billion in retail sales, so it's becoming a sizable industry. In my home state of Oregon, we had nearly $1 billion in sales last year. The taxes generated from those sales help fund our schools, mental health, substance abuse treatment programs, as well as law enforcement and city and county needs. But our federal law has not kept pace with Americans' changing attitudes towards cannabis, nor with changing laws at the state and local level. And that failure has denied legitimate businesses the ability to access the same basic necessities as every other business, whether it's access to banking and credit card accounts, payroll services, and more, because depository institutions and credit unions are worried that they may be threatened with prosecution under federal law. And they have largely refused to work with this industry. So 3/4 of the cannabis economy operates entirely in cash. The few financial institutions that do work with cannabis businesses charge extraordinary fees because of the risk and the added layers of compliance. And the cash-only situation just trickles down far beyond the cannabis growers and the retailers. It proceeds to affect all of the associated businesses, whether they're providing fertilizer or they're setting up greenhouses or they're selling seeds or in any other way connected. And many of them get thrown off their banking as a result of being a supplier to the cannabis economy. It affects employees of these legal cannabis businesses who can't be paid by check or direct deposit. They have to walk around with wallets full of cash, worried that they'll be target for criminals on payday. Forcing legal businesses to operate in a cash economy is terrible for accountability, but it's great for crime. It has left these businesses and all that are connected to them open to violent crime, open to money laundering, employee theft, tax fraud, and more. And Ranking Member Scott, I wanted to mention, there is nothing like a cash economy to facilitate money laundering. The lack of electronic records in this world makes it really easy to move money that shouldn't be moved. And so it's a piece of the conversation I hope will come out as this bill is explored. Now, there's no national database to compile the stats on incidents connected to these businesses, but we do have them for some states. Over the past 12 months, we've had 129 robberies of Oregon cannabis businesses. And we've seen that in state after state because the criminals know that since they're operating in cash, there's cash inside those stores, so they proceed to assault them. They know that the employees might be taking that cash out for transactions, so employees get assaulted. So whether it's the robberies, whether it's the assaults, whether it's the money laundering, all of it is bad news that we can address by passing this bill. If these businesses have the ability to accept debit cards and credit cards, use the same systems to pay their taxes and payrolls, all of those incentives for those crimes goes away. The Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act, or SAFE Banking Act, that Senator Daines and I have introduced and led together would ensure legitimate businesses operating in compliance with state laws in those states where citizens have said they want this, so it's a states' rights issue, will have access to the same financial services as every other business. And I do wanted to mention that as Senator Scott pointed out, we do have provisions here to address the issue of reputational risk being used against certain parts of the economy in an inappropriate way. So we're pleased to add that as a strengthening part of this bill. Financial institutions will be protected against prosecution or asset forfeiture, primarily for providing services to a state-sanctioned cannabis-related business. To be clear, banks will not be forced to provide services to cannabis businesses. It is their choice. But if they provide that, they will have a safe space for the institutions and the industry. It explicitly extends that safe harbor to community development financial institutions that the chairman mentioned, minority depository institutions, MDIs, who serve underserved communities that have been disproportionately affected by cannabis enforcement in the past. After much consultation with colleagues and outside experts, this bill does include provisions to address concerns around equity and issues around law enforcement and money laundering raised in the memo by the Department of Justice last year. As a result, we have a piece of legislation that has significant bipartisan support, significant bicameral support. It's passed out of the House 7 times. It is supported by people who believe the time has come to end the cash economy that hurts people in so many different ways. I'd like to submit into the record letters from current Oregon cannabis retailers sharing their own stories of the challenges and dangers facing them in this all-cash environment.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. Before Senator Daines begins, I'd like to recognize Congressman Blumenauer from Portland, who is here and worked aggressively in the House on this issue. Earl, good to see you. Senator Daines is recognized.
Chairman Brown, thank you. Ranking Member Scott, thank you as well. I'm pleased that the Banking Committee is holding a hearing on this important topic. Across my home state of Montana and in communities across the country, legal businesses are facing a public safety crisis. These businesses, often forced to operate in all cash, are appealing targets for robbers. Senator Merkley talked about what's happening in his state of Oregon. Just to the north of him in Washington state, for instance, 2022 saw at least 100 armed robberies at cannabis retail stores, the most in the past 10 years. Tragically, several of these incidents ended in bloodshed. The SAFE Banking Act would help address a major cause of this increase in violent crime by providing a safe harbor for depository institutions and service providers to transact with state-sanctioned marijuana businesses. In short, this bill would make it much easier for businesses to put their cash into banks. It's really not that complicated. Some of the witnesses today will say that there are hundreds of banks and credit unions providing financial services to state-sanctioned marijuana businesses and that safe banking is not needed. However, the truth is only about 9% of the financial institutions in America have provided services to any marijuana-related businesses, meaning that those who are providing financial services face limited competition and charge substantially more to bank these clients than other businesses, resulting in services being prohibitively expensive for many businesses. This legislation would also help federal and state law enforcement distinguish between the legal and the illegal marijuana businesses. Opponents of this bill will say that safe banking will help to grow the $25 billion market for marijuana in the United States. However, the real size of this market is estimated to be $100 billion, of which roughly 75% is illicit cannabis production. Allowing cash from legal, regulated businesses to enter the banking system will help law enforcement more easily distinguish legitimate actors and focus more of their resources on prosecuting the illicit market, and in doing so, may actually shrink the size of the overall industry and reduce consumption in the United States. If nothing else, safe banking will greatly increase tax compliance and tax revenues for states. This legislation is widely supported by banks, by credit unions, by the insurance industry, and many other service providers who at present do not have clear guidelines for how they can safely and legally transact with state-sanctioned marijuana businesses. Roofers, plumbers, electricians, and other similar service providers, service businesses are technically at risk of engaging in illegal money laundering simply for putting on a few shingles, fixing a leaky pipe, or safely wiring a building. In states where these are legally operating businesses, do opponents of this bill really believe that hardworking tradesmen and women should be put in this impossible position. There's a bipartisan coalition of 38 state and territorial attorney generals who have come out in support of this bill in the past, and we've strengthened it considerably based on feedback from the Department of Justice. I want to quote one of my county sheriffs back in Montana, Lincoln County Sheriff Darren Short. It's up in the very northwest part of Montana. He says this, and I quote, "It concerns me that businesses have such a large amount of cash on hand, which is clearly a liability and a public safety issue. I also believe that any all-cash business is going to be rife with fraud, so it's an accounting problem as I see it too. As far as marijuana legislation goes, the voters of Montana made that decision, and now it's our role to make it safe and make it work. I'm happy to support the Safe Banking Act," end quote. This bill does not legalize marijuana. I personally do not support federal legalization of marijuana. The people of Montana voted 57-43 in a ballot initiative in 2020 to legalize recreational marijuana. The people in states across this country have spoken, and it's abundantly clear that the status quo is not only untenable, it's very dangerous. The Safe Banking Act is a common sense bill that can and should pass and would immediately improve the public safety threats we're seeing on the ground in our states. I ask my colleagues to look at this issue with open eyes, and I look forward to hearing their input today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Senator Merkley, Senator Daines, thanks for joining us. I know you have places to go, so thanks for being part of this. Please, the other witnesses come forward. 3 are in person. I believe Ms. Sullivan is joining us virtually. I will begin the introductions as you're seated. Mr. Adamolo Oyefeso is International Vice President, Director of Legislative and Political Action Department at the United Food and Commercial Workers. Welcome, Mr. Oyefeso. He was the Senior Director of Political Affairs and Strategic Initiatives at the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. Dr. Kevin Sabat is the President and CEO of Smart Approaches to Marijuana, the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. He has an affiliate of Yale University's Institution for Social and Policy Studies at the medical school. He received his Doctorate of Philosophy and Master of Science from Oxford. Is a Marshall Scholar. Welcome. Michelle Sullivan, who is joining us from her home or office, is the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer of Dama Financial. Previous to joining, she held roles Senior Vice President, Director of Corporate Risk Operations, and Senior Vice President, Director of Corporate Fiduciary Compliance. And Ms. Kat Packer is the Vice Chair of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, the Director of Drug Markets and Legal Regulation of the Drug Policy Alliance from 2017 to 22. Ms. Packer served as the first Executive Director of the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation. She received a bachelor and master's degree, a Juris Doctor from Ohio State University. Wish she still lived there, but whatever. Mr. Oyefeso, please begin.
Good morning, Chair Brown and Ranking Member Scott and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Adamola Oyefeso with the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. UFCW represents over 1.3 million hardworking men and women who work in highly regulated industries, including over 10,000 workers in the cannabis industry. Our cannabis members can be found everywhere from seed to sale. As the leading union in cannabis, UFCW is committed to shaping this industry into one that provides safe, well-paid, and family-sustaining jobs for all workers. All jobs have challenges, but few industries face the unique challenge of a federal prohibition on access to legal banking. Workers are paid in cash, and the cash-heavy nature of cannabis retail creates safety and financial problems for businesses, customers, and workers. The majority of people in the cannabis industry are workers, and in order for these workers to have the same opportunities for advancement and safety, Congress must directly address the cannabis banking challenge. There are few banks that are willing to provide their services to cannabis employers, and this leaves workers struggling to find a place to do their own personal banking. Without a bank that will accept their paycheck or proof of employment, like a pay stub, Cannabis workers struggle to purchase homes and often find themselves having to pay higher mortgage rates even though they work in a perfectly legal profession in their state. The lack of banking makes it difficult to get personal loans for homes and cars as well. Ashley Batista, a member of UFCW Local 1776 KS and a worker at Juicy, a cannabis grow and processing facility in Scranton, Pennsylvania, notes the challenges and benefits of banking for her and her coworkers. I've watched several coworkers who saved up every nickel and dime for a down payment on a home just to be denied a home loan due to the legality of their profession. Cannabis workers face negative stereotyping and discrimination also. Having the support of traditional banks would help move away from the stigma on cannabis and gives us an opportunity to qualify for home loans, improve financial stability, and allow us a plan for the future, she said. Cannabis workers are also targets for robbery and theft because they're known to carry cash. Ms. Batista said many employers have cut their security teams entirely and solely rely on workers to watch surveillance cameras. Dispensaries are burglarized and robbed at roughly the same rate or greater as cash-intensive businesses. Cannabis workers, like every other worker, have a right to safe working conditions. Cannabis banking is an equity issue. Equity in this emerging industry is an empty and hollow phrase unless it's made real and meaningful to the majority of the working people living in these communities that were harmed by the war on drugs. A regular paycheck goes hand in hand with good wages, quality, affordable health care, and a secure retirement. All things that are central to what UFCW negotiates for its members, and they come with a good union contract. The emerging cannabis industry presents an unparalleled opportunity for government to shape an industry from the ground up. There are many potential paths for cannabis, but not all paths benefit workers in the industry. A 2021 Economic Policy Institute report analyzed a high road and a low road scenario for the future of the cannabis industry. Under the low road scenario, cannabis workers are subject to the same harmful practices inflicted on workers in similar agricultural settings. And under the high road scenario, unionization ensures that cannabis jobs are good jobs. Access to banking is part of the high road scenario for cannabis workers. Cannabis workers do not deserve to be treated as criminals and should not have to struggle with financial and legal ambiguity on the job. On behalf of all workers in the cannabis industry, we urge Congress to give the same access to financial systems and federal benefits that all other Americans already enjoy. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Oyefaso. Mr. Sapp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Scott. I did notice that there were 5 proponents for this bill, and while I won't ask for equal time, if you don't mind, I have about a 5 or 6 minute oral remarks. Thank you. So given the obvious and widespread problems in the banking industry, I got to say I'm a little surprised that we are discussing this particular issue today at a time when our nation is in danger of defaulting on our debt for the first time in our history, when we have an overdose epidemic in this country that's only getting worse, and frankly, the banking industry is quaking after recent failures. I should note the hearing also comes right in the middle of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services National Prevention Week, at a time when suicide rates for young people are off the charts, mental health challenges are worse than ever before, and frankly, insurance companies are getting away with murder by not covering mental illness the way they do physical illness. The idea that this committee decided to spend its time turbocharging the marijuana industry right now, given everything else going on, I think is unfortunate. And we're spending your important time talking about how we can turn our kids into a great national experiment, an experiment rigged towards addiction, misery, and our next public health calamity. But because we are here, let me briefly state why this bill is not what we need right now. Number one, today's marijuana is more dangerous than ever. And this bill would open up the marijuana industry to Wall Street hedge fund managers and Silicon Valley investors who will create even more hazardous products to get them in the hands of even more Americans. Number two, the bill would open the U.S. financial system to activity from transnational criminal organizations who intend to harm Americans. And number three, it purports to fix essentially a fake problem. Today's marijuana businesses are not dealing primarily in cash. There are hundreds and hundreds of banks working with pot businesses. So issue one, let's be honest here. Today's marijuana is not about Woodstock weed. It's not about 3 to 4% THC. It's more about these products that I am entering in an appendix in my written testimony, these edibles, these candies, these cereals, these concentrates, these waxes, 99% supercharged THC that has a deleterious effect on both physical and mental health. Imagine what this would look like with even more big investors. And frankly, you can take it from your former colleague on the other side, former Speaker John Boehner, one of the biggest proponents of marijuana today, who has said that he said, quote, "I was on the board of a major tobacco company, Reynolds. Do you think big tobacco is staying on the sidelines? I've talked to these guys. They are not going to sit this one out, and they have the dollars to acquire whoever they want." That may make big banks, big tobacco, big alcohol very happy, but it will mean more high-potency products in our schools and neighborhoods, a drug that is now responsible for a third of all schizophrenia cases in young men, according to a very large Danish study that was just released earlier this week. The number one substance found in youth suicide, marijuana, not alcohol, the number one drug for youth going to treatment today because of supercharged marijuana. There are, in fact, more daily marijuana users now than alcohol users, a number that we would have considered unfathomable 10 years ago. These increases we've seen in states like Colorado include 1,000% increases in emergency room admissions for psychosis, schizophrenia, cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which is uncontrollable vomiting, other physical ailments. And we have marijuana stores very carelessly recommending, for example, according to one study, 70% of pot shops recommending marijuana to pregnant women, something no medical association would endorse. In fact, if we were up here with every medical association, almost everyone in this country opposes the legalization and normalization of marijuana, which I think this bill will expedite. Issue two, this bill would give banks cover for federally illegal transactions. That's why the better name for this legislation, I think, is the Addiction Banking Act. This is both a legal and financial bailout that will buttress the banking system at the expense of public health. It will increase money laundering by transnational criminal organizations, giving them access to shell corporations within the United States. It will empower further foreign cartels who are already targeting kids and communities of color that are victimized by this industry. Let's be frank here, banks have a horrible track record when it comes to money laundering with other illegal drugs like fentanyl. That's why 5 former drug czars, including a few of my former bosses in both Republican and Democratic administration, oppose this, and I have entered that in my written statement as well. And as many of you have likely heard from law enforcement in your communities, cartel activity now is booming in legal states. California Governor Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency to contend with cartel activity in the marijuana market, which now dominates about 80% of that market. We should not be fooled. This will help when we will open up this illegal industry to the banks. And finally, issue 3. The U.S. Treasury Department says that marijuana businesses currently work with over 800 banks in this country. Multiple state regulatory bodies, including Colorado, on the record have admitted that marijuana businesses are being banked by state-regulated banks and credit unions. We did our own investigation at SAM, the organization I founded with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, because we do see this as a nonpartisan issue. Our investigation found that pot shops were more than willing to take debit and credit cards and other non-cash means. I have to say one final note as I conclude. As someone who worked in the Obama administration most recently and is dedicated to making sure our drug laws are up to date, evidence-informed, and equitable, we are not calling to arrest workers or arrest users of marijuana, throw them in prison, and increase criminal justice. But on the other hand, why would we normalize and commercialize today's super-strength marijuana at a time when fewer than 2% of marijuana businesses are owned by people of color, when disparity of arrests is still happening in legalized states? In fact, youth marijuana arrests in some legal states are going up, not down. When people like John Boehner represent the industry and groups like the NAACP Illinois are our partner, warning us of persistent inequities in neighborhoods saturated with pot shops, the way they are already inundated with liquor stores and the like. I think we'd be fanning the flames on the addiction crisis that's staring us right in the face. The Addiction Banking Act would reward the industry for sidelining and targeting communities of color. So I urge you, members of the committee, to do the right thing and not make it even easier to normalize and commercialize this very new substance, today's super strength THC, and not make the same mistake as we have with other addictive industries in the past. The fundamental question before us today is whether we should promote and normalize drug use,
during an overdose and addiction crisis, or discourage it by helping people get treatment, achieve full recovery, and discourage use among youth of all drugs. Let's remember that it took us almost 100 years to reverse the public health impacts of the tobacco industry, who continually cast doubt on public health advocates with industry-funded bunk science. We have an opportunity today to not repeat those mistakes. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Sullivan is recognized from a remote location.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and esteemed members of the committee, my name is Michelle Sullivan. I am the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer for Dama Financial. I am honored to testify before this committee to share my experiences and lessons learned in cannabis banking, as well as my opinion on the SAFE Banking Act. I've spent my career in banking, risk management, and compliance, and most recently with a regional bank in Kansas City, Missouri, before joining Dama in 2017. Dama is the largest and the first end-to-end provider of banking and payment solutions for legal cannabis businesses in the United States. Today, we partner with banks which allow our clients a single relationship with multiple financial solutions. This includes everything from access to banking, merchant services, cash management, payments, POS, inventory management solutions, to also include solutions for their employees. Dama was founded in 2016 to provide banking access to licensed cannabis-related businesses with a compliance-first approach following the provisions outlined in the Cole Memo of February 14, 2014, as well as the FinCEN guidance, BSA/AML requirements, and all applicable federal and state laws. Dama partners with banks that would like to provide access to banking but do not always have the resources or the expertise to run a high-risk, cash-intensive business and/or banking program on their own. Dama has developed a gold standard of compliance frameworks to ensure we know our customers through enhanced due diligence, onboarding, and continued oversight. We do so in a safe and sound manner to minimize the risk of money laundering by preventing illegal operators and illicit cash from creating vulnerabilities in our financial ecosystem. To understand the true source of funds, Dama goes beyond the high-risk banking requirements of federal law by doing the following: drilling down to 10% of ownership under the UBO rule and performing on-site inspections and risk assessments that encompass inherent and residual risk through the life cycle of the relationship. We reject a fair number of businesses from qualifying from our services because they are either not transparent with us or they do not meet our diligent standards. Because of these experiences, we believe the SAFE Banking Act should be stronger and encompass a more stringent statutory framework. We cannot simply rely on existing guidance without more robust legislation from Congress. It is quite possible that banking standards could be more lax on the passage of SAFE Banking Act than there is today. If Congress gives financial institutions a safe harbor to provide services to cannabis-related businesses, it must provide a tougher framework than the existing guidance. At a minimum, a financial institution should follow enhanced rules regarding board-approved risk limits, deposit ratios, and reporting criteria when limits are approached or breached, in addition to technology and staffing expertise. We must also include due diligence and ongoing monitoring requirements, especially as it pertains to cash deposits and legacy cash. We also believe that there is a serious potential for confusion in the banking industry following the passage of this legislation the way it's currently written. Will the cash truly get out of the system? We do know that credit card companies have policies against banking illegal products, which may prohibit cannabis transactions running across those rails even after SAFE Bank Act passes. Without solving the larger decriminalization issue, we worry the passage of SAFE Banking Act alone could actually provide worse problems and a sense of resolution while huge conflicts at the federal level still exist. This will make it difficult for some financial institutions to proceed. Lastly, as Congress wrestles with this issue, we think it should do so with a clear understanding of the opportunities for cannabis banking today. This problem is not as dire as it once was. According to FinCEN, there are over 700 financial institutions that work with legal cannabis businesses. Every company that meets the risk standards that I have briefly laid out should have access to a banking solution in America. In my opinion, we should pause and provide more teeth to the existing bill to protect the financial and banking industry as a whole. We are happy that Congress is having this hearing today. We believe that Congress should study these issues very carefully before moving forward, and we look forward to answering your questions, working with senators from both parties to resolve the cannabis banking issues our country is facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Ms. Packer, welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of this committee. I'm honored to be addressing you for today's hearing. My name is Kat Packer, and I serve as the Vice Chair of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, the Director of Drug Markets and Legal Regulation for the Drug Policy Alliance, a cannabis policy practitioner in residence at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, and an advisor to the Parabola Center on Law and Policy. I also had the opportunity to serve as the first Executive Director of the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation, where from 2017 until last year, I led the city's efforts to license and regulate commercial cannabis activity. I first hope to contextualize the topic of today's hearing within the larger scope of challenges experienced by Americans across this nation due to cannabis prohibition and criminalization. While small businesses and workers in state legal cannabis industries should not be treated like criminals, providing protections to financial institutions, as the Safe Banking Act would, may be a first step to addressing banking challenges, but it would not change the fact that small businesses and workers in the cannabis industry will still be considered criminal under federal law. Nor would it end the country's failed approach to marijuana or address the harms of cannabis criminalization and related collateral consequences. Nor would it address related concerns and challenges of researchers, doctors, patients, veterans, immigrants, consumers, or state and local governments. In order to address these issues, we need both Congress and the President to take action on more comprehensive reform. Access to financial services is a basic necessity for any small business. During my time as a local regulator, I worked closely with businesses who continuously shared with me the challenges caused by unfair access to cannabis banking. Many small businesses and participants in the city's social equity program described a lack of access to capital, specifically commercial loans and SBA access, as their number one barrier, not only to entering the legal market, but also to being able to compete once licensed. And while I know the city of Los Angeles has a unique market for a number of different reasons, I know that there are other states that share these concerns and challenges, and these challenges are shared by regulators across the country whose licensees all struggle with inequitable access to capital, and regulators see access to banking as an opportunity to promote public safety, economic opportunity, and support the implementation of an effective regulatory system. While access to banking is an important issue for many stakeholders, small businesses, workers, and state and local regulators alike, there's no better example than the existing banking industry to illustrate the reality that access to banking isn't necessarily fair access to banking. In 2021, a Brookings Institution report found that Black individuals and businesses faced marked disparities compared to their white counterparts in access to banking services, in deposits, mortgage credit, and small business loans. Moreover, a 2021 Federal Reserve report found that Black and Latino-owned businesses were less than half as likely as their white counterparts to be fully approved for loan applications during the last year. Last summer, with the support of Ohio State University, the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition published a paper that called out the difference between expanded access and fair access. And I'm happy to see that after spending last year working with stakeholders and leaders, folks are making efforts to ensure that the Safe Banking Act doesn't just provide protections for financial institutions, but that it includes minor and technical changes to ensure that banking access is fair. That's, after all, what the F in SAFE stands for. I ask that you refer to my written remarks for more comprehensive details about how minor technical amendments to the Safe Banking Act can make the bill and cannabis banking more fair. But I'd like to provide one quick example that illustrates how SAFE can be further improved to promote fairness. Existing guidance from federal banking regulators considers criminal records a red flag or an automatic indication that a business may be engaged in illegal activity. One of our recommendations is to ensure that this updated guidance clarify that cannabis criminal records, specifically those that have been expunged or are for activity that has been pardoned or is no longer prohibited under state law, are not automatically considered red flags. Addressing this issue would allow SAFE to better promote fairness. It's true that small businesses and workers can't afford to continue to be shut out of banking, but it's also true that they can't afford for the disparities in traditional banking to become the new norm for cannabis banking. And moreover, communities all across America can't afford for the harms of cannabis criminalization to continue unchecked. Thank you for your time and consideration, and I look forward to working with the committee and Congress as we build momentum to address not only the challenge of cannabis banking, but all of the challenges caused by the failed policy of cannabis criminalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Packer. The question will begin by Senator Reed.
Well, first, let me thank the chairman and the ranking member for their courtesy. Thank you all for your testimony. This Safe Banking Act is, in the popular image, is focused on cannabis sales and finances involving those sales. But there's one section in the bill, Section 10, that does not apply exclusively to cannabis. It would apply to any entity that's engaged with a bank, company, or a customer. And it would make it more difficult for federal regulators to raise the alarm about relationships with any customer that presents significant risks to the bank. And as I said, it's not limited to marijuana industry, cannabis industry, so it could allow pyramid schemes or all sorts of other interesting activity to go on without an effective response by the regulator. In addition, Section 10 will require a bank to provide a notice to a customer when the federal government suspects they may be engaging in legal activity. Well, that's like warning people to get out of town and take the money and run, I think, is the popular image. But and it has drawn some criticism, not only some criticism, but significant criticism from consumer groups. So, Mr. Chairman, I would request unanimous consent to introduce a letter from the Americans for Financial Reform, Consumer Action, Consumer Federation of America, National Association of Consumer Advocates, the National Consumer Law Center, and the National Consumers League.
Without objection,
Thank you. All of that being said, Ms. Packer, you had very thoughtful comments in your testimony regarding technical amendments to the Act, et cetera, to improve it. And would it be sensible, in your view, to limit the scope of this act simply to the cannabis industry and not have this wide open restraint on federal regulation?
Thank you, Senator. I have to be frank in that my expertise and engagement with this FAR has been on cannabis banking. And that being said, this hearing today is about cannabis banking. This bill is supposed to be about cannabis banking. And for that reason, I think if there's an intent to use the bill to do something else, then maybe it's appropriate for another bill.
I think that's great. In fact, I think your reaction is probably the reaction of everyone saying, this is all about cannabis banking, and suddenly we have a provision that would stop a regulator from going to a bank and questioning a relationship with a customer who may be a surrogate of a foreign power that's doing things here we don't like to be doing. And so I would hope that we could look very carefully at this. I think the trajectory that is designed to provide reforms for cannabis is appropriate. We have a little more work to do, but I think this is definitely something that we can narrow considerably. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your kindness, and I would yield.
Senator Scott's recognized.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sullivan, thank you for your testimony today. Given your role as the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at DAMA, it seems that you are very familiar with compliance and risk regimes when it comes to safe banking. Can you walk me through, if the Safe Banking Act were to become law, how the current safe harbor for financial services institutions would work?
Thank you. If the Safe Banking Act, the way it was written today, was pushed forward, the concern would be is that there would not be any, there wouldn't be steps to ensure that financial services that would be provided to cannabis-related businesses would be legitimate. There would not be proper governance and controls in place that financial services would have to ensure that they were doing to include really addressing some of the major things that we focus on and a lot of the other financial institutions in the industry today focus on, which is legacy cash. We also know that credit card networks do not allow cannabis transactions today. We know merchant acquirers are establishing fictitious names such as flower shops to process these transactions. So money laundering is happening. And it really, honestly, it's going to dilute the standards that many of the industry is performing today.
Thank you. One final question for you. In your testimony, you discussed requirements to ensure that banks have the appropriate risk controls and processes in place if they were to bank cannabis. Can you give a little more detail on what those requirements would look like? You started to talk about the legacy cash and other issues. Love for you to continue that conversation.
Absolutely. So with our program and with what our recommendations are, we would like to see that financial institutions really have to have a strong and robust framework. They need to really work with their board to make sure they have board approved risk limits. Their deposit ratios versus their total deposits need to be within line so they don't have a concentration. Legacy cash, for example, all legacy cash deposits must provide documented evidence of the source and the origination of that ownership, to include any evidentiary documentation for that cannabis transactions. What's important to note is just because cash gets banked, it does not mean that money laundering is not occurring. If financial institutions are not taking their role and responsibility to, one, know who their customers are, ensure that they understand where the source of funds are coming from, and do the continued due diligence and transaction monitoring that has to be done in this industry, it would be a money launderer's holiday if banks are not going to take this position seriously.
Thank you. Dr. Sabat, you talked about synthetic marijuana and the real impact it has on the brain, some of the challenges that we have. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. With my minute and 47 seconds, I'm going to ask you a compound question. Second part is, can you explain your concerns about the impact of cartel activity in the United States as it relates to safe banking, allowing for perhaps more fentanyl to flow through?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm concerned with is the active ingredient in marijuana, THC. Marijuana has hundreds of ingredients in it. It's a very complex plant. But we know that THC acts on receptors throughout the brain and the rest of our body that regulate a whole host of activity, coordination, reward, and memory. That's why marijuana can be addictive. In fact, 1 in 3 Americans who use in the last year, according to all the studies, fall under what we call a cannabis use disorder or addiction. And so when that THC enters that brain, especially as that brain is developing, 25, 30 years old, 21 is a political number. It's not a scientific number when we have age limits of 21. It's really 25 or even 30. And so it has the ability to really affect that person as that brain is growing, as that brain is developing. So now we've learned how to genetically breed marijuana to increase that THC to levels we couldn't have imagined 10 or 15 years ago. The fact that so much of the industry is selling these high potency concentrates that can be up to, they claim, 99.9% THC shatter, or these waxes, these are products that did not exist before this industry started. It's really interesting. Not that what we had before was great either, obviously, with transnational organizations running the whole thing, but this legal industry has innovated in such a way that they've created kid-friendly products. The gummy bears, the candies, the concentrates, it never existed before legalization. The second part of your question about the underground market, I really do worry about the ability of cartels and transnational criminal groups to take advantage. They're already taking advantage of the system. Illegal marijuana markets have grown in legal states, not shrunken. People might say, well, why is that? We've legalized something. Why would we have that? We have that because the demand goes way up. It's normalized, commercialized. It's pushed on social media. That's why I wish Congress would actually recommence an anti-drug media campaign in social media for kids to understand the true facts, not, reefer madness and scare tactics, but the true facts about marijuana. Because this industry, advertises, and so as the demand goes up,
The government cannot fill that demand. The government has regulations, taxes, et cetera. The illegal market, very happy to come in much cheaper, not follow those regulations. In fact, a lot of, as you know, cartels, they're making money from a diverse set of industries, not just one drug or one thing.
Wrap up.
Human trafficking, et cetera, it's all mixed together. So I would be concerned about the cartel activity. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Scott. Dr. Sabat, since I gave you 2 extra minutes at the beginning, I would like a yes or no answer in this. Your organization states that removing criminal penalties for possession is a must as part of a comprehensive marijuana policy. Do you stand by that statement?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Oyefeso, thank you for joining us. I want workers and small business in my state to be able to have access to financial services. I want small banks and credit unions to provide that in a way that's equitable and affordable. I'm worried about large companies and Wall Street firms dominating this industry. We've made that very clear to supporters of this bill. Do you share that concern? Why is it good for workers and small businesses to have a fair and competitive market?
Yeah, simple answer, yes, I do share that concern. A competitive market allows wages to grow. If there's heavy consolidation in the industry, you'll end up with a few companies able to regulate and demand and control the salaries, the wages, and the benefits of all of these workers, and of the pricing of the products for consumers. So having this bill pass allows workers, more companies to open up, and allows workers the ability to negotiate a better wage and benefits package.
Okay, thank you. Borrowers, especially first-time home buyers and veterans, use federally backed loans from programs like VA and FHA to finance their home. But talk about the barriers employees at legal cannabis businesses face when they're trying to buy a home. You mentioned that just briefly. Expand that a bit. How does this bill help address those barriers?
I'll use the example of Miranda Beck, who works in Starbuds in Maryland, in Baltimore, Maryland. Her and her colleagues get paid in cash. And beyond the risk of being robbed on a daily when they're getting paid, they also have to now prove proof of employment. But they're being paid in cash, so they don't have a proof of employment. So when you're trying to get a home or rent an apartment, whichever it may be, you can't go to a mortgage lender and say, here's my proof of employment, here's my salary, here's my W-2, or to a landlord and say, here's my proof of employment, please rent me the apartment. So they're completely at a disadvantage in moving up the ladder of life just because they're working. The industry's legal in the state of Maryland, but it's not federally legal, and the employer isn't fully banked. So while there are 700 to 800 banks that do business throughout the country, cannabis is legal in just about every state in the union. 700 to 800 is minuscule when you're a worker sitting in the heart of Baltimore, in Brooklyn, New York, in Cleveland, Ohio. If you have to travel 10, 12 miles to reach your bank.
Thank you. Ms. Packer, you spent 5 years as a cannabis regulator. What were the challenges that the government faced when it came to banking, and what about small businesses?
Thank you, Chairman Brown. I described a situation earlier where even trying to create small business assistance for our city social equity program was a challenge, but even things like the collection of taxes and fees and other regulatory responsibilities are extraordinarily complicated by an abnormal banking environment. I'll give you an example of what was happening in the city of Los Angeles. To handle the cash-intensive nature of the cannabis industry, the city of Los Angeles had to have a specific cannabis cash collection unit at our city hall. And anyone who wanted to make an appointment over $1,000 had to do so in person. This was a headache for small businesses having to come in person to make just regular tax payments, regular fee payments. And for the city of Los Angeles, this was not a small issue. In fiscal year 2022, the city of Los Angeles accepted over $26.3 million in cash.
Talk to me about community-based institutions, including MDIs and CDFIs. How are they important to promote fairness in cannabis banking in the broader industry?
I appreciate that there's been an intention to include CDFIs and MDIs in the 2023 version of SAFE. It's critically important for these particular institutions to be able to have access to the safe harbor. These are institutions that regularly provide financial services to Black and brown communities. They are specifically serving communities that are designated as socially vulnerable and prone to economic, health, and safety challenges. And given that they're literally serving the same communities that were targeted by the war on drugs, it's essential for them to receive this safe harbor and to be able to participate in providing services.
Thank you. Senator Daines of Montana is recognized.
Chairman Brown, thank you. Before we get started, too, I want to recognize Congressman Joyce, a colleague on the House side who's been instrumental in getting this done. Grateful for his leadership and a big thank you. I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to submit a few statements and letters of support in the record, if I could, Mr. Chairman.
So ordered.
Thank you. I'd also like to begin my time by addressing the human factor of this equation. Mr. Oyefeso, I think you're probably as good a witness on this as any on this particular topic. Because in your testimony, you touched on the physical dangers, including being robbed at gunpoint. Cannabis workers are facing danger because they and their employer are forced to operate primarily in cash under the current system. From what you have heard from your members, is the situation on the ground getting safer or more dangerous for cannabis employees and the public?
It's not safer. It's getting more dangerous because people, as we've heard, more and more people are going to these stores. So criminals now realize that there's more and more possibilities of robbing large amounts of cash. So now workers, if your dispensary doesn't have a security team, people with guns standing there, you have to worry that when you're closing at night, are people going to rush in and rob you? We've had members who, if you're getting paid in cash, if a former worker knows the payday and you're getting paid in cash, you're going home. And we have members who are pharmacists at Cannabis Dispensary who make $68 an hour. So these are good jobs when they're organized, and they can go home with $2,000 and worry about, I'm holding $2,000 cash in my pocket, where the rest of us get paid and it's direct deposited into our bank. So there is your weekly take home that you could lose in a night. There is your life you can lose. You go to work, you have a good job, you want to go home to your family. And because it's not banked, you have that risk every night.
I mentioned in my own testimony, as we think about the employees of these businesses, but you think about the other businesses that serve these businesses, the tradesmen and women. If they're going to fix a leaky pipe or fix a wire, that transaction is going to occur in cash. And so the subcontractors that might be trying to do some work with these legal businesses are also put at risk. So thank you for your testimony. I'd like to switch gears and touch on the current cannabis landscape across the United States. Over the past decade, 22 states have legalized the medical use of cannabis, with 20 of these states have taken the additional step of legalizing recreational use, and that includes my home state of Montana. Cannabis use is decriminalized in some form in 47 states and the District of Columbia. Well, I personally voted against legalizing recreational use, and here's kind of a part of politics. I won my reelect 55 to 45 in Montana, while the ballot initiative passed 57-43. I recognize and appreciate the reality that we face. And that reality is a legal patchwork that just doesn't work for banks, for businesses, or for law enforcement. Mr. Sabat, has any state that has legalized cannabis, either medicinally or recreationally, taken any steps to recriminalize it?
Actually, in 1990, when Alaska decriminalized marijuana, they recriminalized it very, soon after because of the negative effects. We've also seen lately states trying to get a handle on THC content and trying to limit that. But with this industry and the lobbyists and the people behind it, it's very difficult to do that because, like in your state, as you know, Senator, the pro side is outspending the teachers and the parents something like 20 to 1. So it's very difficult to do that. I will say
you use the example of Alaska, What's the status of?
Well, then Alaska, after spending $5 million, legalized it in 2012.
But I just want to make sure you paint the accurate picture.
Yeah.
It is a fact what you stated. But I think if we really want to state the truth and the whole picture, they also then follow. I mean, maybe you just put that in the record as well.
Please. Yeah, I mean, so what has happened on the local level, though, I think is very important. The majority of localities in most legal states have outright banned the sales of marijuana. So you have the majority, not all legal states have done that, but the vast majority of legal states where they voted for it state-wise, at the local community level, when people are asked, do you want a marijuana store in your, Main Street or whatever in your community? According to the League of Cities and many other sources, we know that, for example, I don't know, I mean, Ms. Packer would know better about California. It used to be 70-some%. I don't know what it is now. But the vast majority of these localities have actually voted against that.
Mr. Sabat, in your testimony, you cite an article from Bloomberg suggesting that cannabis businesses have widespread access to banking services. However, I pointed out in my testimony that only 9% of financial institutions offer banking services. We look at the totality.
Sure.
The article you cite also states that, and I quote, such estimates may overstate the real number, many say, because they would include institutions that have only temporarily worked with cannabis companies, end quote. My question is this: do you have any other data that would suggest that cannabis businesses have easy and widespread access to financial services? Because the story here from both businesses and then financial institutions is quite different.
Yeah.
Please be very brief.
Sure. So the 2 points of data would be the U.S. Department of Treasury, and I think it's in my statement that talks about it. The second one would be the on-the-record statements of regulatory bodies in states like Colorado that talk about the local banks and the co-ops, et cetera.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, both you and to the ranking member, for having this hearing. It's such an important bill that I hope we have the ability to pass in a bipartisan way. Let me start with, is it Mr. Oyefeso and Ms. Packer? The Secure and Fair Enforcement Act, or the SAFE Act, as we are all talking about today, would finally allow businesses, cannabis businesses, full access to the U.S. banking center. Right now, legitimate cannabis businesses all over Nevada are hurting because they can't access traditional banking. My office heard from one business owner in Las Vegas who said that the lack of access to banking creates logistical headaches and puts her and her employees at risk. Her business has to deposit large amounts of cash at local banks, often at more than one bank in the same day because of cash deposit limits. This is burdensome and, quite frankly, dangerous. Last year, after one of those deposit runs, this business owner's car was broken into. And fearing that whoever had broken into her car now knew from her bank deposit slips that she carried large amounts of cash, her co-workers bought her a taser. And she keeps it by her bed at night to feel safe. Now, this is outrageous. Banks already accept the money that legitimate marijuana business pay contractors and security firms, and it's just common sense that they should serve the actual businesses too. So there's been a lot of support for the SAFE Act, bipartisan support. It passed out of the House of Representatives 7 times. 38 state and territory attorney generals have called for SAFE to pass. So let me just ask this question. We had nearly $700 million in total sales last year in Nevada. And what are the consequences for owners and employees operating as mostly an all-cash business? And Mr. Ofeyeso, let me start with you. Mm-hmm.
The simple answer is death. In an industry that has $700 million in cash in Nevada, we have members in your state in the cannabis industry. It's a constant fear of, if I'm depositing money, what happens? If I am going home with cash from my pay period, what happens to me? You have a steady flow of customers. I've been to dispensaries in Nevada. You have a steady flow of customers, whether it's people who live there coming from different parts or visitors, and everyone knows you're dealing in cash. So there's a constant worry of what you're carrying, what you're leaving with. And you also have the problem for delivery workers. In some states, cannabis, you can deliver cannabis. So now you have an individual who is making deliveries who everyone knows he's carrying cash. And, I'm a New Yorker. Delivery drivers always had to worry in the 80s and 90s about cash. Now, if you're delivering food, it's done through one of the apps. But for cannabis, it's not. So you worry about, I'm just doing a run and someone could rob me or hurt me.
So Nevada has the second most sales per capita, just behind Colorado. And this is a concern I hear from businesses all the time. Not only their concern about their safety, but the concern about their workers, the concern at the end of the day also that a lot of their overhead goes into security, just because they are an all-cash business. Ms. Packer, what would be the long-term consequences for businesses and workers of not passing this SAFE Act that we haven't talked about already?
Yeah, I think what's been articulated by many businesses is that they literally just cannot afford to continue to pay the high fees to be at risk. And that's part of the reason why I and the organizations that I work with have been advocating for fair access. It's important that as we move this bill forward, that we don't continue to have categories of folks who are going to be dealing in just cash. There's a real opportunity to ensure that we're bringing everyone into the banking system that provides oversight as a regulator. That's critically important. For the workers in particular, there's a real opportunity for us to ensure that they're just treated like normal businesses. There's a real concern that we're going to allow stigma to continue in this space as well.
I appreciate that. Let me ask this question, and very briefly, I only have about 16 seconds left here, but many business owners, parents, and members of local law enforcement have expressed concerns about the proliferation of the gray market. There's no doubt tied to the cost consumers pay for cannabis as a result of the exorbitant fees and unusual expenses businesses have to pay to function, like hiring armored cars that I talked about. But can you talk to me about the gray market? Can you define that for me?
Yeah, and I appreciate you asking me the question because I've had conversations with folk about what we use as the term. I encourage folks not to use the term black market. I know we've heard folks use this term before. We don't want to equate black with illegal. But part of the reality is that this increases a safety concern. There are businesses in the city of Los Angeles, for example, particularly, I'm talking specifically about unlicensed, unregulated businesses, and that's how I would define them. They're outside of the regulatory scope, but they're going to continue to engage in cash. And for some of the businesses that we engage with in the city of Los Angeles is primarily law enforcement. You had illegal cannabis businesses that were looking to try and set up and rob legal cannabis businesses.
Thank you. I notice my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So Senator Warren of Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think the Safe Banking Act is a long overdue step to help legal cannabis businesses in Massachusetts and all across the country be able finally to open bank accounts, accept credit cards, and access other basic banking services. Businesses need these services to operate safely and successfully, and workers need the protection from safety risks of working in cash-only businesses. So I look forward to working with my colleagues to pass this bill, but it cannot be the end of our work on marijuana policy. That's because as long as marijuana remains criminalized federally, we're not fully fixing the problem. If people can still get busted for purchasing marijuana, many banks will find it too risky to serve legal cannabis businesses, no matter whether we tell them it is technically okay. Now, I've pushed the administration to use its administrative authority to deschedule marijuana. Like my friend and neighbor, Dr. Sabat, said in his opening testimony, no one should be incarcerated just because they got caught with a joint. The White House has directed HHS and DOJ to review how marijuana is scheduled. That will affect research going forward and what we come to understand about it, but we need to see those agencies act. Ms. Packer, you have years of experience in the cannabis industry, both as a regulator and as a drug reform advocate. Would fully decriminalizing marijuana at the federal level help ensure that small businesses get full access to safe, formal financial services?
Thank you, Senator Warren. I appreciate all the work that you're doing to push the administration to take further acts. Yes, it would certainly help. The reality is that even with a safe harbor, many financial institutions are likely to continue to view the industry as risky due to its Schedule I status. And even if cannabis was rescheduled, for example, to Schedule V, the small businesses and workers that we're talking about today, they'd still be criminalized. And so I want to just emphasize this. The only way to eliminate the criminality of small businesses and workers is to completely remove cannabis from the controlled substances schedule. We want to deschedule, not reschedule.
I hear your point, and I recognize that descheduling not only helps ensure that small cannabis businesses have access to safe, formal financial services, but it also deals with a bigger problem, and that is, while the Safe Banking Act is a critical step on cannabis reform, we risk creating a system in which banks enjoy a safe harbor from prosecution for financing marijuana businesses, while thousands of people remain incarcerated for marijuana activities. In my view, the best solution is full federal decriminalization, but we should also make sure that updates to our banking laws take equity into account. For example, when banks consider whether to serve a cannabis business, they consider the red flags that are laid out in the 2014 FinCEN guidance. One of those red flags is whether the business's owner has a drug-related conviction, which could include a conviction for something like marijuana purchase. So even as we try to move away from penalizing nonviolent marijuana activity, a penalty for marijuana activity is baked into lending decisions. And we know that Black Americans are almost 4 times more likely than white Americans to be arrested for marijuana possession. So, Ms. Packer, would making it clear that financial institutions should not consider a marijuana criminal record an automatic red flag make our banking system more equitable?
Yes, it absolutely would. The reality is that we're in a situation today, it's no longer 2014, right? Since 2014, we've had 25 states, we're at a point now where we have 25 states that have passed laws to expunge records, provide folks to second chances. We're also in a situation where we have 15 states that include people with past cannabis criminal records, affirmatively allow these people to participate. We don't want to sit here and tell states either that their state policies don't matter and that they can't pick and choose who should be a part of their market.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. You know, the Safe Banking Act requires FinCEN to update its guidance when this bill becomes law, and this change should be at the top of their list. We need a comprehensive, all-of-the-above approach to cannabis reform that includes safe banking as well as decriminalization, pardoning and expungement of criminal records, and other steps to begin to address decades of harmful and racially discriminatory cannabis laws. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warren. Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sabet, as far as I understand, Canada has now made marijuana legal, right? Is it fair to say that it hasn't slid into anarchy?
It would be safe to say that. In fact, I spend a lot of my time in British Columbia, and so I could say that it's a beautiful place, but no one predicted it would slid into anarchy. It's just seen some increases in use. It's seen some DUI issues. It has seen the doctors of Ontario and Quebec call for more awareness on high-potency THC given emergency room admissions.
So in other words, it's okay. It's okay.
Well, that part's not okay. That part's not okay. But it's not slid into anarchy. You're right.
And then let me just say, with respect, so so I know obviously you oppose legalizing marijuana, and I presume because you believe that it's dangerous and it could result in a lot of deaths, right?
It's one reason.
Yeah. So how many annual deaths for alcohol use is called?
There are about 120,000 annual deaths for alcohol.
120,000. Yeah. We agree with that. That's actually about right. How many deaths does cigarettes have in America every year?
Yeah, still about 400 some thousand. Our legal drugs have many more, kill many more people than our illegal ones, partly because they are fueled by a for-profit addictive industry that I know, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your work on this, fighting big tobacco for so long. Our legal drugs kill a lot of people because they're advertised and promoted in a system that
So in other words, though, alcohol and tobacco should be made illegal then?
Well, we're stuck with them because of their cultural, where they've been in our.
Because it's addictive. It's addictive, and there's a lot of profits on that. And then also another question is that how many people have died of aspirin?
A few thousand a year, maybe.
3,000, yeah. Okay. So you were just talking about THA just a few earlier.
Yeah.
So how many people have overdosed from death?
Well, overdose, there's a difference between overdose and overdose death. Overdose, we have probably hundreds of thousands of overdoses, not necessarily resulting in death. Tobacco doesn't provide an overdose.
Well, the answer is
death.
zero. That's a lot
tobacco
of words.
Is also zero.
Zero.
Yes, Senator, tobacco is also
Because
zero overdose.
Zero has, and that's my point.
But thousands of deaths from drugs.
Sir. So and it's like, see, you talked about THC, say that this is not my grandpa's weed or whatever. But from my standpoint, it's like, have you know what grain alcohol is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it's sold in Pennsylvania state store, and I don't know anyone that walks in and is oh my God, I ended up with grain alcohol instead of this red bottle of red wine. Yeah. People can understand that as well too. Yeah. And again, that seems like it. So, and I don't use marijuana. It could be made tomorrow. It could be made legal tomorrow in Pennsylvania, and I'm not going to. Just like I'm not going to use tobacco. And I'm just saying I support the SAFE Act. But if we just made it legal, we don't have the special SAFE beer act or anything. We just need to make it legal in that. So what I'm saying to you, and I'm going to save you the last minute here, is that I just believe it's freedom. I believe it's a freedom issue for people, and I believe that it's making the legality. And I've been given hundreds and hundreds of people pardons, because of having their lives ruined by having a BS charge. And that's what I was about me. So to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Senator Fetterman. I appreciate the time. I agree with you on pardons and expungement. I agree with you on removing criminal penalties. I wish we could make a distinction between decriminalization and the commercialization and legalization.
That's honestly, I'm glad to find you together. That's a really
no, absolutely. And I also agree with your logic that we don't have a Safe Beer Act. So let's have an honest debate. We might disagree at the end of the day, but let's have an honest debate on the legalization of drugs, because we're seeing states legalize psychedelics now. There's talk about heroin and cocaine. Are we going to have a Safe Psychedelics Act, a safe cocaine or heroin, a safe fentanyl act? I mean, let's have an honest debate on the merits as opposed to some giveaway for banks. We might disagree, Senator Fetterman, but we can have that honest debate and conversation. So I appreciate that. I'll also say that I think we need to talk, we've talked about the human toll of the industry. We need to talk about the human toll of the use of this super strength THC. The suicides that we're seeing, the schizophrenia and psychosis we're documenting daily, where scientists are on this, the driving crashes. We work with a woman named Corinne Lamarca in your state of Ohio, Mr. Chairman, whose daughter was killed by someone driving high on marijuana, 19-year-old daughter. That's a human story too. And so we shouldn't lock people up. We should not give criminal records. We should not have a incarceration-focused war on drugs. But at the same time, I think we're going to this other extreme of acceptance over normalization, and I think people are getting hurt as a result.
Thanks, Senator Fetterman. Senator Smith of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Fetterman, for those questions. I think you're touching on something that is very important, which is kind of the question of freedom. I would like to draw out another piece here, which is that how the federal prohibition on cannabis is a policy that has contributed to mass incarceration and over-policing, that it is not disproportionately, it has not affected all communities the same. It has disproportionately affected Black and brown communities. So we have a lot of work ahead of us to right those wrongs. And I believe that this includes decriminalizing marijuana and then expunging convictions. But we also have an important role to play in our corner of this work in this committee with the Safe Banking Act. So, Ms. Packer, let me ask you, the Safe Banking Act has, in the latest version, explicitly protects community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions. Can you just talk to us about how this could help expand opportunities for communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on cannabis?
Thank you, Senator Smith. CDFIs and MDIs disproportionately lend to Black and brown communities. CDFIs in particular are folks who regularly lend to small business, to do agriculture, for commercial real estate, and these are the exact sectors that the cannabis industry and hemp industry need. So they are serving the underserved.
Yes, thank you for that. I completely agree. And I'm just grateful for the chair for the timeliness of this hearing and convening this hearing. Minnesota is on the cusp of legalizing recreational cannabis, and this is an exciting development, opportunity for small businesses and others. And the reality is that cannabis shops in Minnesota will effectively operate in the shadows so long as state and federal laws are out of sync, right? So for Mr. Oyefeso, could you talk about the challenges that this presents for workers at cannabis businesses and their employers in states like Minnesota that are moving to legalize? What impact does that have on them?
One of the impacts is, Mrs. Sabat brought up people prescribing to pregnant women. Training, the UFCW has created a training program with employers, but we can't expand it without SAFE. So when you pass SAFE, you can expand a training program that allows workers and employers to properly train workers and brings them out of poorly prescribing different potency levels to the wrong person. That's a big part of it, being able to educate workers, but you have to have the funds and the ability to build this in.
Right, thank you. And Ms. Packer, how does this sort of, one foot in each, world regulatory environment that you have with states legalizing and then these federal laws, how does that affect, people who are, cannabis consumers?
I think part of it is that it just causes confusion. I think that there's a lot of confusion amongst consumers, and folks aren't necessarily always able to tell licensed and regulated businesses from unlicensed businesses. And the same concerns that folks have about workers in the space, consumers are entering these places as well where cash is on hand. And so I think the concern extends to them as well.
Both the chair and I serve on the Agriculture Committee as well as the Banking Housing Committee. And in 2018, the Farm Bill legalized hemp cultivation for commercial use. Licensed growers went up, but then they've been coming down. It was seen as a big opportunity in Minnesota and other states around the country, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one constant concern I've heard from Minnesota growers has been a lack of access to basic banking. It's tough to get loans or to access payment processing. So, Ms. Packer, have you heard similar concerns about this from farmers? And how can this committee support hemp growers to help them, grow their business and diversify their business?
Yeah, thank you. In the city of Los Angeles, we were working primarily with folks who are doing indoor cultivation. But the reality is that this is an issue across the supply chain, whether it's cultivators, manufacturers, distributors, folks who are engaged in retail sale. They are all similarly plagued by a lack of fair access to banking.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Thanks to the four witnesses that joined us. Senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due 1 week from today, Thursday, May 18th. For the witnesses, please, you have 45 days to respond to any questions. Thank you again. The hearing is adjourned.